Great, thanks so much. Welcome everyone to today's Council on Foreign Relations CV Star and Co. annual lecture on China. I'm Dan Kurtzfehlen. I'm the editor of Foreign Affairs. Today's lecture is in fact a discussion with the not exactly modest title, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, America, China, and the Global Order. That's quite the question to grapple with over the course of the next hour. Fortunately, we've got three panelists who are not only each incredibly accomplished and distinguished in his or her own right, but also bring really a kind of fascinating mix of perspectives to the questions at hand. And say from the perspective of someone in the foreign policy world, a mix of perspectives that are too rarely brought together in one conversation. So that gives me hope that we can make some progress here. We have Ray Dalio, who has long been well known as the founder and co-chair of Bridgewater, the world's largest hedge fund, but he's also increasingly well known for bringing the insights and experience of Bridgewater to analysis of global economic and political currents, which he does in his forthcoming book, The Changing World Order, Why Nations Succeed and Fail. Liz Economy is well known to everyone at the Council as one of the foremost American scholars of China. She is the author of The Third Revolution, Xi Jinping and the New Chinese State. She also sent off a manuscript of a new book over the weekend that will be out later this year. After a couple of decades leading the Asia program at the Council, she has recently decamped for Hoover on the West Coast, but she is still a senior fellow for China Studies at the Council, so she will be with us going forward. And then we have Paul Kennedy, one of the foremost historians of international relations. He's a professor at Yale and has written a slew of important books on everything from naval history to the United Nations and beyond, but he is probably best known for The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, which is, of course, most pertinent to the discussion today. I also want to note that Hank Greenberg, the chairman and CEO of CV Star, is, I believe, with us today. I'm sorry not to be able to peer out into the audience to confirm that, but if so, glad he could join us. Paul, since the title of your book was borrowed for this session today, it's only fair that we start with you. If you were doing the preface to the 2021 edition of Rise and Fall, but as, say, a 3-minute YouTube video, how would you apply the lessons of that 500-year span that you analyzed in the book and the dynamics you illuminated in that work to the US and China today?
Thank you, Dan. Nice to be here. Dan, I would say candidly that the story rolls on. The Rise and Fall of a Great Powers book came out some 30-odd years ago. It did not suggest that history had come to a full stop when the book came out. It rather suggested that history was moving on. And has it not moved on since late 1980s? A big factor, the one we're discussing chiefly today, the focus of so many other considerations and panels, etc., is how are we in the United States here, but across the global commons, how are we to understand another chapter in the rise and fall of great powers, namely the substantive, and I stress substantive rise of China as a world power. Well, by whatever means we measure it, and we have some great panelists with us to help us measure it, whatever way we measure it, economic, military, strategic, political influence, there is a significant larger player and a larger presence on the world scene for the United States and the other powers around China, Russia, European Union, India, to respond to. So it's China at the center of our debate, I think.
Liz, how does that question look from Beijing today, and particularly from the vantage of the CCP? We've heard increasingly brash statements about the course of history from senior Chinese leaders over the last few years. Xi Jinping himself has said something like time and momentum are on our side. Does that reflect warranted confidence about their own position vis-a-vis the United States? How do they see American prospects right now?
Thanks, Dan. It's great to be here with you and with Paul and Ray. And let me also just add my thanks to the Star Foundation and to Hank Greenberg and Florence Davis for all of their support of the Council and, frankly, their incredible support of the Asia Studies program over the past few decades. So to your point, yes, I think it's important to recognize this is a big year for China. It's the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. They're at the beginning of their 14th five-year plan, and they're on the cusp of 2022, where they're going to have a leadership transition for the Communist Party. Of course, not any real mystery about who's going to come out on top. But the messaging, in this kind of year is naturally going to be very positive, very optimistic. And I'd say at this point, it's, veering on triumphal. Basically, the message is that the wind is at China's back. Coming out of the pandemic, China did fare the best economically of all the large economies. Xi Jinping, as you suggest, says that China is both, riding and driving the wave of globalization and technological innovation. There's a sense, I think, that, China is on the rise. It has Xi Jinping at the helm. The United States, in contrast, is viewed as, politically polarized, weak economically, and the message is that it has no chance of reclaiming its position as the world superpower. We've had 3 speeches by senior foreign policy officials, senior Chinese foreign policy officials over the past 2 months. They have said that they want to work with the United States. They want to find areas of cooperation, climate change, the pandemic, cyber terrorism, but that they expect the United States is going to redress all of the problems of the Trump administration, right? Going to sort of take care of the distorted view of China as a strategic competitor, take care of the fact that the United States does not respect China's core interests in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, and take care of all the restrictions that it's placed on Chinese companies and media outlets and Confucius Institute. So I think what we hear from the Chinese leadership right now is a sense of, as I said, triumphalism with some lecturing thrown in, a little bit of openness and a faint undercurrent of concern. I do think it's important, though, to recognize that if you go one level down, right? So if you move sort of beyond the level of the topmost Chinese elite, that you do hear more openly expressed concern about the potential of the Biden administration to cause more problems for China than even the Trump administration did. I think there's worry that the Biden administration promises, in some respects, the worst of 2 worlds, that it will be just as tough on China as the Trump administration was, but it's also going to be more effective at reasserting leadership on the global stage, more effective at building coalitions, pushing back against China in places like the United Nations. I would just note that, in Cui Tiankai, who's the Chinese ambassador to the United States, in his speech last month, he talked about, he said, any US effort to build a coalition in Asia to balance against China would fail, that it was basically like putting, old wine in a new bottle. But I think, anytime someone tells you that something's going to fail, that they're worried about it. So I do think it's important to recognize that there is concern about the Biden administration, that it will take what the Chinese had thought was really just an economic and technological competition and add a layer of values onto it. And finally, I think there's also just a little more humility among Chinese scholars and analysts in the sense that they recognize that China has caused some of its own problems, that it's alienated a lot of countries with its wolf warrior diplomacy, that there are problems in the Belt and Road Initiative, and that these may offer opportunities for the United States, to capitalize on. So I think that there is a difference probably in the 2 levels, in terms of how they're thinking about their own position on the global stage and relative to the United States, in the sense that in the scholarly and analytical community, there is more of a sense that, acknowledgement of China's own missteps and extent to which they believe the United States can recover both reputationally and economically.
We'll come back to both some of those concerns and the policy questions a bit later in this conversation. But first, I want to go to Ray. Ray, you bring a pretty unique lens to this discussion as a macro investor. What should we be paying attention to if you look at the indicators that are perhaps more familiar to your team at Bridgewater than to the typical foreign policymaker or analyst? What do you see about dynamics today that the rest of us might be missing?
Well, there were 3 big things that happened starting a few years ago and it's the confluence of these 3 things that led me to go back and study it through history. And those 3 things are, there's a financial economic piece in which you hit 0 interest rates. There's the printing of money, the creation of debt, and that has an impact and threatens a world reserve currency. So in that piece you described, the changing world order, which anyone Excuse me, I didn't silence my phone, so let me just shut that. Sorry. The Changing World Order, you can see this going back. It's on LinkedIn if anyone wants to read it, but you hit zero interest rates. You can't stimulate in the normal way. The production of a lot of debt, and that has an effect on the reserve currency status and so on. And so I've studied over the last the 500 years, these three cycles of the rise of the Dutch and the Dutch guilder, which is the world reserve currency, the British pound, and so on. Those patterns that are existing today, the production of debt necessary to stimulate the economy and the value of money is number one. The second, which is related, is the size of the wealth gap. And with that, the size of the opportunity gap and the values gap and the political gaps. So that's the second factor, and it's very related. And the third is the rise of a great power to challenge an existing great power, China. The three things. They're very interrelated. And so when we're looking at the picture, I think we have to look at all three of those related, and they've repeated through history. Each one of those, I just use statistics to measure, like a health index. Each one of those is most analogous to the 1930s period. We can talk about what historical periods, but it goes back to prior to that. So there is an economic and capitalist cycle in which the boom creates debt and an overextension that reaches a limit. And that in turn, if you have this mix, if you have a lot of debt and you have bad balances and you have a big wealth gap and a big values gap, and you have an economic downturn, and you have a rise of a power challenging an existing power, you have internal conflicts and wars. So it's that confluence that I'm seeing.
Before we get to some of the U.S. dynamics that you alluded to, Ray, let's talk a bit more about China and where its strengths and weaknesses lie. Liz, let's go to you first. I mean, you alluded to some concerns that Chinese leadership may have underlying that triumphalist narrative. When you look at China today, what are the weaknesses, whether political or economic or social, that you think are concealed by that narrative of success and that might end up coming to the surface in the years ahead?
Sure. I mean, I think, of course, the Chinese system is always a little opaque. And so, you're looking for clues, I think, more than anything else. But I think there are really three potential risks. And the first is political, and that political discontent would somehow coalesce to challenge Xi Jinping. Where might that come from? I think, entrepreneurs who feel as though their ability to be creative at home and to access foreign markets is increasingly constrained by Xi Jinping's demands that they serve the party. I think a middle class that's interested in having a greater say in their political future, and we saw evidence of that certainly in the aftermath of Dr. Li Wenliang's death last February, when you had this burst of calls for freedom of speech on the Chinese internet, when we had that period of openness. There's also been a really interesting uptick in articles by young Chinese talking about their desire for greater freedom of speech. I think there's a debate over privacy that is ready to explode again among the Chinese middle class that could have ramifications for Xi's surveillance state. And then I just point to a letter that was circulated last spring that called on Li Keqiang and Wang Yang and Wang Qishan, who are three other senior leaders in the Standing Committee of the Politburo, calling on them to challenge Xi Jinping. Now, this may mean nothing, but it also may be an important signal that there are real differences within the topmost leadership. I think if nothing else, it reminds us that while Xi Jinping has, really an extraordinary degree of institutional control, that does differ from legitimacy. I'll just quickly say, I think, the challenges, another possibility is that the challenges in the Chinese economy are more severe and systemic than we appreciate. And I'm sure Ray has some thoughts on this, but, Lo Jiwei, the former Minister of Finance, just came out with an article that was, raised a lot of concerns about the rising level of Chinese debt. we know that there's a mismatch in terms of Chinese labor demand and supply, with a shortage of high-skilled workers, but no jobs for migrant workers, individual entrepreneurs who haven't recovered from the pandemic. Despite Xi Jinping's claims of eradicating absolute poverty, you still have 600 million people in the country who are living on $140 per month or less, and a college education rate, or I say a high school graduation rate of about 30%. So and that's a long-term drag, I think, on the Chinese economy. Divorce is skyrocketing, birth rates are plummeting. These are things that tend to track with economic optimism. So, what is that telling us about the way that the Chinese people themselves are looking at the Chinese economy? So again, I just think it's an important reminder that, there can be underlying problems that we can't really see that could come to a head in surprising ways. And then the last one, I won't go into detail. I kind of already alluded to it, and that is that there's international pushback against China. And that's not just from the United States, but that countries, Belt and Road countries, there are protests in all of them. China's sort of trust in Xi Jinping and a desire for China to be, either a regional or a global leader. If you look at polls across the world, you're looking at rates of, 10, 15, 20%. So, China's global image is quite weak. So I think that's another area of potential concern for the Chinese leadership.
Ray, let me get you to expand on the economic piece of that. When you look at the risks of the Chinese economy, how significant are those? What should be keeping economic policymakers in China up at night?
Not significant if you put them in the big picture. I've been going there since 1984, and I go through the statistics. I know it. I'm just measuring things, and I know the economic leaders. And so you look at its track record. I won't summarize its track record. I think the track record speaks for itself. And then you look at the balances. When you're comparing a country, you have to look like individuals or a company, or even a state and local government. Is the income greater than the expenditures? And are they building, and what does the balance sheet look like? Income and balance sheet. Their income and balance sheet positions are excellent, and their debt is denominated in their local currency, and its considerably debt to GDP ratio is about 250%. The United States is about 350%. And so their balance sheet and their income statements are stronger, and they can manage those things. The real things to pay attention to is the rate at which they are opening up and evolving. So through history, every major reserve currency great empire was the largest trading country in the world, and developed a financial center, and then developed great financial power. So if you, just the facts, the Dutch, largest trading country, reserve currency, financial center. The British, same. The US, same. What you've seen in terms of the opening up of the financial center and the being able to offer companies that are world-class companies, world-class competitors in technology, in so many different ways, that are attractive to invest in. I could only, in 2015, a foreigner could only invest 2% of the financial markets. Now it's 60%. So what's happening now is a balance of payments shift. The world is invested, international investors are very overweighted the dollar and dollar denominated bonds, because the US has been a world reserve currency and they're underweighted. China is now underweighted. They view that as competitors and a form of diversification. And the opening of the capital markets is letting money come in. I see no significant vulnerabilities. That doesn't mean there's perfection. I'm sure there is internal issues of all sorts of things. But when I watch the skill and the lay of the land, it really, the flows, the development and all, really the growth, the innovation is on their side.
Paul, when you look at this mix of attributes and risks and everything else, to what extent do you see China following the typical path of a rising power? If you look at the last 500 years. And to the extent that Chinese policymakers have studied your book, which I'm sure many of them have, what do you think they've taken from it?
I go along with Ray. It looks very close to a larger macro pattern of economic and military growth of a rising great power, which is about to have a ever bigger impact upon the world, distribution of power and the distribution of influence. And as I was listening to Ray listing the economic attributes of strength there, I thought I might introduce, Dan, just one other piece in the jigsaw puzzle, which is, and I know every one of us has a different set of professional journals we read, the background information we collect. I just been perusing this past weekend the sort of end of 2020 issue of the Naval War College Review, and the lead article in the Naval War College Review is something called China's Global Navy. It's a substantive 30-page piece with a lot of additional data, which makes me think, at least, and I'm sure will make many others think. It looks as if every year over the past 20, 30 years, China has just been launching another 10, 11, 12 or more modern ships to replace the older frigates and the older submarines and stuff in its Navy. Every year it launches about 3 times more ships, warships, than we do. Every year, the size of its Navy and the capacity and destructive strength of its Navy for asymmetric warfare against the biggest Navy of all rises and rises and rises. So when we have rather warmer relations with China, they keep on building. And when we have rather soured relations with China, they keep on building. And then when we have a summit meeting in Hawaii or whatever, they keep on building. So there's something just eerily substantive and, you know, I wouldn't say ominous, though you may think the word is ominous. It is attempting to shift the overall naval strategic balances of the world. And by my money and by the sort of authorship of so many pieces on the Chinese military expansion today, following on the economic expansion that Ray's describing, we are pretty close to talking about a rising contender for the #1 position in world affairs.
Paul, you know, I think we in the United States always find a way to take comfort in declinist fears by noting, as Sam Huntington famously did in Foreign Affairs a few decades ago, that the fears of decline will somehow spur our renewal, will kind of force us to get our act together at home. And we see the latest version of this call with the China challenge. The specifics of what getting our act together means obviously varies quite a lot according to policy or ideological preference. It could mean, you know, we should invest more in the military or have Medicare for all, or, you know, renew our national purpose or something else. But let me start with you on the premise of that basic analysis. Is the Huntington version of the American way of declinism correct? I mean, do you think that there is hope that the challenge from this new contender will spur needed changes in the United States? Is that something that tends to happen in these cycles?
Yes, and I would say also that a well-known phrase in diplomatic history is that great #1 powers take a long, long time to move away from their position at the top because they have a fantastic amount of received strengths, diplomatic strengths, positional strengths, probably geostrategical strengths as well. And the large powers, even say the Ottoman Empire, had bursts and bursts of reformism to try and get its act right, to try and preserve itself. So I see nothing unusual about our having yet another debate about what the United States, which has been #1 since at least the Second World War, and in economic terms since the First World War, what it will do to keep its position at the top and to stave off elements within its own society and relative across the globe of relative decline. But nonetheless, if I and Ray are measuring the relative economic and the relative military indicators, they are steadily moving towards Beijing.
Ray, what to your mind would American renewal look like? What are the key changes that we need to make at home, especially on the economic front, to address some of the fears that you derive from your analysis?
Well, I'm very mechanistic in terms of we have deficits, so we're spending more than we're earning, and so there's that financial piece, and that's not an easy one to solve because by spending, what do? You cut your spending? No, you can't do that. You become more productive. I mean, we'd all like to be more productive. That's not easy to do. We're in a situation where there are a lot of bonds, and we're going to have to sell a lot of bonds to the rest of the world that already has too much of those bonds and is moving. So it's not an easy situation with the wealth gap and the internal. So as we look at, let's say, the internal conflict, can we agree even on how money is spent productively, as well as there's a redistribution? We have to worry about whether we have enough money or whether we're just going to print the money. And so when we look at this, there's so many expenses, the guns and butter. If we look at, let's say, the military, we can go down the programs that are being listed now, and then there's the question of maintaining a military comparison. So when we look at history, the capacity to invest and spend when it's limited is a real issue. I think the biggest issue that we're dealing with is we are not able ourselves to work well with ourselves. So the two big ingredients I think that are necessary, but they're very improbable, is that you have bipartisan, skilled engineering of the economy and the circumstances so we don't hurt each other, and that but you're going to need a revolution of sorts, because the existing system, how it's structured, does not provide the opportunity, equal opportunity, or does not provide the things that are needed to be productive. In other words, there's a reason, for example, that the wealth gap is being produced. And through history, those reasons are when you have a capitalist period and it creates a large wealth gap for a variety of reasons. You include technology replacing people and the such, you have to re-engineer for that. And there's not much in the way of agreement on what should be done. So I can't imagine that the cores of the political parties, which are almost wanting to kill each other, actually polls show quite a bit of that. How do you bring it together? How do you re-engineer it with the circumstances that we now have where we're spending too much, productivity, our education programs are deteriorating, those types of things? It's not easy.
Liz, maybe we can end this portion of the conversation on what I think will be a slightly more optimistic note, which is the state of our kind of China policy in the United States. You suggested that you see the Biden administration starting to embrace a policy that you think will be effective. To what extent do you think we are getting there, and what would that strategy look like to your mind?
Sure. I do think it's interesting, though, if I could just comment on Ray's point about sort of the wealth gap and productivity levels, et cetera, that these are also issues that China confronts. And so it's interesting to consider, why they would play out quite so, in addition to the demographic challenge that China faces, why they would play out quite so differently in China than they would in the United States. But in any case, it just struck me as I was listening to you how well your descriptor also applied to China.
Would you like me to answer? I'll pause. I thought if you want me to answer, I could do that.
We can go back to you quickly after Liz's answer, Ray, if that's okay.
Sure.
So I think, yes, I am very optimistic about U.S.-China policy. I think, the Trump administration actually left the Biden administration in a reasonably good position. They identified, I think, all of the really important challenges that China presented from, as we've heard, China's growing military capabilities, its activities in South China Sea, Belt and Road, the digital authoritarianism, what's going on in Xinjiang. So, and they started to put in place a lot of defensive strategies. I think what the Biden administration is going to bring is, first an incredibly deep bench in terms of China expertise, which they've put in not only all of the sort of key positions where you would expect to see people, but also in secondary positions. So, the number 2 person at the US mission to the UN is a China expert. I think that's going to have an important impact in terms of our ability to, rally countries together within the United Nations when we see China pushing forward on things on human rights and internet governance that are moving in the wrong direction. I think that this administration, the threat perception, their understanding of the challenge that China presents is not really very different from that of the Trump administration. But already, we are seeing the United States sort of reassert itself, in international institutions and organizations. We're back in the Paris Climate Agreement, the World Health Organization, the UN Human Rights Commission. We can't, win at anything that we're playing at any game if we just take our marbles and go home, which is essentially what the Trump administration did when it pulled out of all of these organizations. So I think having the US back is incredibly important. Working again with our allies and partners. Look, the Trump administration actually had a really great working relationship with our allies in Asia. I think there's been an extraordinary new partnership that's developed with India, in addition to sort of affirmation of our relations with Australia and Japan through the Quad and the Free and Open Indo-Pacific. I think the Biden administration is going to focus on repairing relations with our European allies. And I think one of the interesting things now is sort of the new interest that Europe is taking in security in the Asia Pacific. So I see a lot of, the head of NATO talking about the need for NATO to be more involved in Asia Pacific security. So I think there's going to be an interesting potential to knit together a new kind of alliance between our partners in Europe and our partners in Asia. Also, I think that the administration is taking its time to unwind Trump administration policies, which I think is smart. It gives us leverage, all those tariffs. So look to see whether any of them actually do benefit the United States. My guess is not many of them. I think it's pretty clear that the tariffs have hurt the US economy more than they've hurt the Chinese economy. But I think this administration is being smart in not simply jettisoning all of the Trump administration policies. We've talked about the focus on renewing America. I actually am a little more optimistic than I think, Ray perhaps is, about American capacity, for innovation and to stay ahead of China. So I take some hope there, but I think that, getting back in the Paris Climate Accord, thinking about sustainability and innovation are important elements of this. And then I guess last, this is an administration that, is reopening the door to cooperation with China. It was a door that the Trump administration pretty firmly shut. But I think it's also an administration that is not going to cooperate for cooperation's sake. And so as the president said, when it's in Americans' interest for us to cooperate with China, then we'll do so. And I just think that's smart policy.
Ray, let's go to you for 30 seconds on inequality and some of the other points Liz made about China's economy before we go to questions.
Yeah, through history, there are 3 main things that is a confluence that this has. If you have a bad financial situation and you have a lot of debt, so if income is less than your expenditures, and you have a bad balance sheet, and you have a lot of debt, and you have an economic downturn with a large wealth gap, that is the combustible combination that produces the problems. In the case of, I'm just trying to make the comparison with China. In China, besides their income statement and balance sheet being better, their living standards are rising. Since I've been going there. So there's contentment, there's excitement, there's happiness there. There's a large wealth gap, but that's when the living standards are rising. Per capita income, when I started going there since 1984, it's risen 22 times. The poverty rate has declined by 88. The life expectancy's increased by 10 years. So there is not discontent. There is a wealth gap that's analogous to us. It's top of mind, but the boat is rising. And so it's an environment in which there's enthusiasm in China more than there is the feeling here when you're having that decline and you have a debt to deal with it. So that's That's a big difference.
I'm going to resist the temptation to keep asking all three of you questions, though I have a long list, and we will go to Q&A from members. A reminder that this meeting is on the record, and that includes your questions. The operator will remind you how to join the question queue. And just note there are 800 something people on the call, so we'll get to as many questions as possible, but certainly not all.
Ladies and gentlemen, as a reminder, please click the raise hand icon on your Zoom window to ask a question. When you're called on, accept the unmute now button and proceed with your name, affiliation, and question. To view the roster of CFR members registered to attend the meeting, click on the link in your Zoom chat box. We will take our first question from Daniel Rundy.
Hi, it's Dan Rundy. Thanks so much. This is a fabulous panel. I wanted to just flag two issues of demography and education for China that I just think that if I look at sort of the one-child policy has been very destructive, and that they may get old before they get rich. But also I would just flag, so that's kind of point one. And point two is there's a book that was flagged in Foreign Policy magazine or foreignpolicy.com last month about Invisible China, the urban-rural divide threatens China's rise. That's something like only like 30 or so % of Chinese citizens have graduated high school. Now that's rapidly changing, but supposedly something like 60% of a society has to have graduated high school for a country to escape middle-income country status. So I would posit that issues of demography, which they're not going to be able to escape, and education, which will take a long time, are going to be such that they may experience Brazil levels of development, and that we may actually be okay. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Liz, do you want to start with that one?
No, I honestly, Dan, thank you for that. I actually hosted the author of that book for a roundtable, Invisible China. So completely agree. And actually, I also mentioned both those facts in my very quick run through of potential concerns. So I agree with you. I think the demographic issues, pension system is another problem that they haven't addressed. And again, the falling birth rates, they moved to a two-child policy. They're talking about moving to having no restrictions on births, but it doesn't matter. The birth rates have fallen every year since 2016. They had one bump up when they announced the two-child policy, and they've continued to decline. They, I think, last year hit the lowest rate since 1952. So I think it is a serious issue. It has to do with their, future consumption levels. It has to do with their ability to innovate. Fewer young people who are at the, front end of innovation. So that's why I suggested I think they have some issues that are a long-term drag on the economy. May not be front and center like the ones that Ray identified, but I think they're issues that the Chinese leadership is actually quite concerned about.
Paul or Ray, anything you want to add on those?
Yes, Dan, thank you for that question. And the demographics of China really are daunting. And as Elizabeth says, that the indicators are not going in a favorable direction for balanced demographic for China. On the other hand, Dan, I'm struck, and I think Ray would also be struck at how often over the past 20 or 30 years, when we in the West, especially we in the United States, point to a certain weakness in China, they listen and try to think of ways of dealing with it. If we point to their environmental stress or their sort of coal emissions, they scratch their heads and say, well, we're going to deal with it. In 2 or 3 years' time, they deal with it. If we point to their having old aircraft carriers, they scratch their head, and 5 years later, they start building new aircraft carriers. So I suspect that they know every one of the list of weaknesses which we fasten on, Dan, to console ourselves that they have such a lot of problems that surely they'll never be able to push us away as number one. And that makes me uneasy that we do discuss their weaknesses, because I get the sense that they're going to try and improve on those weaknesses and make sure they aren't so weak.
Right.
Well, should I?
Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, the demographics, of course, it's an issue, but I don't know to what extent it's an advantage or a disadvantage in some sense, in that what we're now dealing with, let's say the big issue, is how technology is replacing people. and how that's changing income levels around the world and so on. That's a problem that actually nobody's figured out yet, and it has to be figured out. And if you look at our stated obligations in the form of either healthcare obligations or pension obligations, which are now committed to, which they don't have as much of, but they still have to take care of the population. But we have, they're much greater than our debts. So we have a lot of obligations. I don't know that, but if you look at history all through these times, China, I studied the dynasties in China going back to the Tang Dynasty just after the year 600. And I watched that. And so when you see, and I compared them to power around the world, and China since then has normally been number one or number two or number three in the world. They have a long history of great success. And the period from around 1840 to 1949, which made the bottom essentially, was an abnormal period. So if you look at the history, the culture, and what's also happening, it's a great power.
Let's go to the next question.
Take our next question from Ellen Chesler. Please accept the unmute now button.
Ellen, you're still muted. There you go.
That was my mistake, so go on to the next one. Thank you, sorry.
Not a problem. We'll move on and take our next question from Fred Hochberg. Please accept the unmute now button.
Hi there. Hi, everybody. China's model, I've heard others say, is hard to replicate. In other words, Indonesia, Malaysia, other countries with smaller populations could not enforce tech transfer, IPR theft, and things like that. So it seems that their economic model is much harder to replicate than perhaps some of the Western models. And then you read today about the cyber attack in India on potentially on the power grid. So how does that talk about their ability to really expand their global reach and global power? Since they have a system that's hard to replicate, and they often, I think, Liz, they have that sort of lone wolf or wolf warrior approach that seems to be pushed back against their sort of ability to really replicate and expand their power.
Ray, do you want to start with this one? We can go to Paul and Liz.
I think that I would describe their power, their system as state capitalism. That's the closest to it. And I think we will be paying more attention to that even ourselves, as we need to probably have an industrial policy to be dealing with the technology, artificial intelligence, and certain types of developments. I think the question is how you can have, their model is, top-down, autocratic political control, information control, and at the same time being able to create a capitalist model, that a free market, and having innovation, entrepreneurship. It's not an easy model to follow. However, all countries toggle between how much should be controlled, and also, like, are we getting a little out of control is one of those issues. And then there's the question of also, does capitalism work in achieving the goals, or how do you achieve that wealth distribution? So it's a question that we both balance. We both have to, all countries have to deal with on that sort of continuum. How do you get the balance right? And so I think that, and also I would say their way of controlling historically has been through the tribute system, never, in other words, letting other countries largely pursue their systems, their religions, their whatever their preferences are, and to have arrangements with them, just as long as those countries know their places, through a tribute system, and that might be trade or other ways, because they don't want to fight a war. So I don't think their objective is to conquer, take over, or even evangelize their particular system. It's simply to interact in sort of that way that I'm describing. Be strong domestically, be strong economically, and then interact and power, whatever power you have, that is your influence. Because the best way to fight a war is never to fight a war because you're going to kill each other. The best way to fight a war is to have a great power, show the opposition what the power is, and they will not be motivated to fight. And then through evolution, and not control is the model.
Paul, could I ask you to, can I just add a historical gloss to Fred's question for you? Does it historically matter if a power is able to, if its system is transferable and attractive to others? Is that part of the equation here in a meaningful way?
It has been a supposition, Dan, from the preachers of early British liberalism across the world, like Cobden and others. We have the model, just imitate us, and then we will all be part of a similar sorts of models. The American liberals, all from Wilson onwards, thought that we have the model, and if you just imitate us, we live in this world where we're all the same. I would ask members of the council, Dan, to think about whether this language is a bit outdated, especially because we've used it too much, as you well know, during the Cold War. Is there a Soviet model which an African state might imitate and worry us about? Is there a good American model, a democratic liberal model too? I suspect that across the globe, and I'd be interested in Elizabeth's view here, across the globe, there's probably a large number of rather smart African countries or Malaya or Singapore, which are saying, I'm going to take as much of this American Western model as I need for my economic interests, and I'm going to borrow some of the Chinese aspects when I think it suits. Models are just not single sort of construct works for all.
Liz?
So let me just make a couple of quick points. I think first, certainly we've had other, state capitalist models come and look at Taiwan, Japan, South Korea. The interesting thing about all of them, of course, is that eventually they transformed into democracies. And I think that's what many people have been waiting to see, whether those same kinds of pressures, emerge in China. Arguably they have in the past, but they've been quashed. Second, in terms of China's export of its model, this is a big debate in the China field, and I would say, look, the Belt and Road to some extent is in effect an export of China's model. It is China's development model. It's large scale infrastructure, debt driven, with all the externalities that come along with it, which is lack of transparency in the deal making, weak environmental practices and weak labor practices. And that's why in virtually every single Belt and Road country, you're having protests against many of these projects. And a lot of leaders are actually renegotiating the terms and doing other things. I also think, look, China may not want to fight wars, but, it just had a border, confrontation with India in which people were killed. I think when it comes to sovereignty issues, China's got 14 at least territorial disputes. Reunification is at the heart of Xi Jinping's rejuvenation narrative. And sooner or later, if somehow the magnetism of China is not enough to persuade those 21 million people living in freedom in Taiwan that, yes, it's just easier to succumb rather than to fight, I think China will be willing to go to war over Taiwan. And I think that's something that the United States and other major democracies are going to have to be prepared to address. And in terms of the attraction of the China model, sure, I think there are a few states that are attracted to it, but it's really hard to be attracted to a model that represses its people, that basically imprisons 1.5 million Uyghur Muslims in labor and re-education camps, and does things like forced sterilization. So I think when we're thinking about the rise of China and everything that's going to bring, I think it brings with it a lot of other challenges that we haven't actually touched on.
Let's go to another question. Hopefully we can get maybe 2 more in.
We'll take our next question from Ed Cox.
Question is one of the general American view that Deng and his successors were good. They were taking China down the path of free market capitalism and towards a more democratic kind of government. And Xi is bad, and that he's taking China in another direction. But From the Chinese leadership point of view, continuity of policy is very important to their legitimacy. And when you think back upon it, Deng's statements was more, let's bide our time, let's not show our strength, and what he did in Tiananmen, and Jim Lilly's statements at the time about these evil old men in China, while we're all optimistic about them. Isn't Xi just, especially as the Chinese leadership would see it, just the logical extension of what Deng wanted all along? And that is Chinese to really, at some time, they'd have to come out of under covers and show their strength and impose their natural order of being a leader, certainly in East Asia and perhaps in the world.
I mean, I guess I'll quickly.
Sorry, my internet is freezing, so I missed
Oh,
that.
sorry. Okay, so then I'll just
Yeah.
offer a few thoughts. Look, I think Xi Jinping is not the first leader to talk about the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, and Deng talked about the invigoration. And I think, Ed, you're right in the sense that, sure, I mean, Deng Xiaoping did say, if China ever emerges as this great power and we're oppressive, et cetera, then come back and push back against us. So given that, I think that's exactly what Xi Jinping is doing. So maybe Deng would exhort all of the rest of the world now to push back against China. But sure, I think that every Chinese leader has wanted to reclaim a degree of centrality for China on the global stage. Do I think that Xi's way of governance would necessarily have been Deng's? Probably not. I mean, I think Deng was much more willing to experiment, was much more open to the input from the outside, both in terms of external ideas and foreign capital, although as Ray's pointed out, that's changing. But also, he was about removing the party, in many respects from everyday political and economic life. And Xi Jinping has been all about reasserting the power of the Chinese Communist Party, and the extensive surveillance system. Tiananmen Square was something that, moved off track from Deng's perspective. But up until that time, they were talking about moving elections up through the political system, beginning with local elections and moving up. And periodically, we've seen much greater periods of openness in the Chinese political system. Look throughout the 2000s, for example, the mid-1990s, the explosion in terms of Chinese civil society, environmental activism, the internet. You had a virtual political space by the end of the 2000s. What we've seen under Xi Jinping is quite different. So I don't think he's the natural extension of Deng Xiaoping, maybe on the global stage a little bit, but not domestically.
I would again disagree with that. I would say the way that they view it, and I think the way that we should view it, is that there's an arc that takes place and that produces rising and rising levels of power. And so when in 1978, Deng Xiaoping opened, reform and opened the economy, and like you say, made sure it was not appearing threatening. That was a natural evolution to acquire certain amounts of strength that they have. And with those amounts of strength, I think Xi views himself within a historical arc that is about, look at dynasties, they're about 250 years for a dynasty. And as you gain different levels of power, you become more assertive. There's no change, in fact, more the development of the economic policies of opening up the innovation, capital markets, that market economy. That arc has developed and is continuing in that way. The assertiveness is a natural consequence of the going along with the associated power. And I think that if we take a larger look, that basic trajectory from Chinese study history is their religion. And if you follow that arc of a dynasty, you see essentially that what would it look like in another 25 years? What would it look like in 50 years? And they paint the pictures well. And so if we're dealing with the control issue, it is correct, and history has shown, that there are ebbs and flows in control. So they have what they call the core leadership, the 7 standing members of the Politburo, and they move toward a more core picture, which doesn't mean there's an absence of dialogue, but it is more core control. And with that core control, that's a normal movement during periods of greater challenge. Historically, that seemed to be the pattern. So I think that if you're looking at the arc of development and you're not connecting it to the power that's there, it's a natural consequence. As you said, Ed, you can't, you can't hide the power anymore. So there we are.
Paul?
Ed, you used at the very beginning of your question, you used that wonderful phrase, bide your time. I actually think that when the Chinese are smart, sometimes they fumble, sometimes they have Tiananmen Square, Elizabeth, sometimes they have internal crisis that they worry about. But on the whole, if they're looking at the arc of history, as Ray says, then their advisors, their long-term planners will say, are we likely to be rather bigger in world affairs and the measure and share of a world economy by the year 2030 than we are now? Well, why not just wait a bit more? Are we likely to be even bigger by 2035 and have 6 aircraft carriers rather than 3 aircraft carriers now? Well, why not wait? So this is a long-standing story, and we spend our time wondering about the weaknesses of China. If they're thinking we can get through those weaknesses and just wait another 10 years, another 20 years, will the US be able to be around in East Asia and the Western Pacific in 20 years' time? Probably not. We can do a gentle move against them, Elizabeth, by then. Let's just not rush it or antagonize them now. And if Mr. Biden wants a more harmonious diplomacy, that's good for us. We can bide our time.
Can I just say, I don't disagree with what you just described as Chinese strategic thinking and sort of the biding time and how Xi Jinping is looking at this period moving forward. But what I am saying is that internally, there are differences of opinion and different strategies. And when Premier Wen Jiabao talked about the need for political reform, that's very different from what Xi Jinping is doing domestically. They're not monolithic, right? It's not a monolith. And so the arc of history can show you one thing, and it's very sort of easy to connect those dots and in hindsight, but look inside the country, and it reveals, I think, something quite different. And you have to be attuned to those things. So yes, we should be paying attention to the strategic challenge that China poses, to its innovation, to its economic growth, absolutely. But at the same time, we can't miss the story about what's going on inside China. Otherwise, we end up like we did with the Soviet Union, right? And all of a sudden, everybody knew that the Soviet Union was actually weak and that there would be a Gorbachev, when actually nobody was really talking about that.
Let's go to one last very quick question.
We'll take our last question from Seema Modi.
Thank you so much. A fantastic conversation today. My name is Seema Modi, Global Markets Correspondent at CNBC Business News. My question is to Ray Dalio. There are these powerful forces underway right now in China, as you've alluded to in this conversation, from the leadership changes, wealth gap, to other societal changes. I'm wondering how this all impacts financial markets. So how do you think this sort of lends itself to the stock market here in the US or in China?
It's opening the flows into Chinese markets. There's a weakening of the dollar, which is partially due to our monetary and fiscal policies, but simultaneously, when they open their capital markets and they have relatively attractive capital markets. Their bond market is more attractive because it offers a higher yield and appreciation currency and so on. There's a shift in capital, more increasing flows into those capital markets. And so you're seeing the development of those capital markets. And so with time, we will start to see that we'll be looking at China and its offerings to the world market and its financial center. And it'll rise in much the same way as New York rose to increasingly compete with and eventually replace London in terms of that. And so watch the total return of investments, which includes the currency return and the asset return, because that reflects the relative shift in wealth. And so you see not only their markets performing well in their currency, but you've seen a rise in their currency by about 10% in an orderly way, as there's the movement of capital that is supporting the currency as well as their capital markets. There's a need in the world to diversify. And there's two great powers. And even if you were to think about technology, who do you want to bet on? Or on most things, Europe is not a competitor. No place else in the world is a competitor. And so from a capital markets point of view, China is a competitor, a viable competitor that's opening up, and the net flows are net beneficial to them to make their performance good.
We will have to end on that note, but huge thanks to Ray Dalio, Liz Economy, and Paul Kennedy. Wonderful panel. I could keep going all afternoon personally, but the council will not allow us to. So we'll stop there. Thanks so much to all three of you, and hope everyone has a good afternoon.